It was part of a larger program looking at production of almonds and other nuts industries here and interstate. The project came about because putting organic amendments out, particularly compost, in the tree row prior to planting trees is actually a widespread activity in the almond industry. It has been for a number of years. Anecdotally, about half the orchards that are going in have compost put out before the trees go into the ground. There's a cost associated with that, and there was no information on whether it had a benefit, and if there was a benefit, was it cost effective? So we set up a trial to test the existing commercial practice, putting out about 10 tonnes per hectare, dropping it in the tree row, rotary hoeing it into the ground, and then planting the trees into that, as well as some different application methods, high rates versus higher rates initially and repeat applications. We also looked at dripper versus sprinkler irrigation and a tree mounding, row mounding system known as super soil. The trial's 7.4 hectares, 2,304 trees. Definitely need to know that. You can see the irrigation treatments standing out fairly clearly in the square patches there. So it's obviously the one in the middle. So standard application process, drop the compost on the ground, run along with a rotary hoe, and then plant your trees into the prepared bed. So that's the high rate, which is 50 tonnes per hectare. Typical commercial application is 10 to 15 tonnes per hectare. Another method was to inject it into the subsoil using a prototype machine which mixed the compost into a slurry and then injected it down about 400 to 450 mils deep and down two modified spouts either side of the tree row, basically to protect the compost from overly rapid breakdown by UV and microorganisms right at the surface, so giving it a chance to persist in the soil a bit more and maybe give some more benefit to the plants as they grow. Looks weird, doesn't it? Black gold. Spaders are quite widely used in broadacre, but I'm not aware of them having had much use in perennial horticulture. So this is an intermittent cultivation down to about 300 mils depth, so it's mixing compost in and modifying the soil structure down to that depth. So again, that's a different approach. It's intermittent mixing, but more soil modification than you'll get from a rotary hoe. The ryegrass pre-treatment or super soil system was developed by Bruce Cockcroft in Victoria. It involves growing ryegrass in the topsoil for 12 months and then pulling that topsoil into a mound, growing the trees in the mound, but also growing ryegrass at the same time, whilst keeping it far enough away from the trees that you're not getting too much competition. And the aim is to optimise the soil structure from the ryegrass roots, which are known to be very beneficial, and maintain that optimum structure as long as possible. We did have some challenges with that particular treatment. So what do we measure? The height of the trees, trunk diameter, which are both indicators of tree size. Yield, once the tree is mature enough to produce nuts, we measured yield, and we also measured soil parameters, physical, chemical, some biological, penetrometer resistance, and an assay of root growth. Tree size. There's a whole bunch of treatments there. The one on the left is control, nothing, different types and rates of application, compost application, and then the mounded treatment and the sprinkler systems over here. This is 2021, the trees are 3 years old, and tree height in the bars, trunk diameter in the lines, and if you just look from the left, which is the control, across, there's not a great deal happening. Pretty much the same with the trunk diameter as well. In 2019, the first year we measured it, the spading and the high compost were actually up a bit. So there was an initial early boost, but that gradually faded. And last year there was very little, I mean the spading and the high compost was still there, but there was really very little in it. In 2020, the trees had only been in the ground 2 years. It was the year before the first proper harvest, but some of the trees had some nuts, so we thought, well, we'll go pick them by hand and just see what happens. And here it's like spading and high compost, gee, they look really good. But if you look across to the scale here, 20 kilograms per hectare in commercial terms, that's nothing. So this is just the first indication, the year before the first proper harvest. And then the first harvest, spading and high compost is still okay, and they're a bit above the control, but it really has flattened out a lot. We had trouble with the super soil, with plant competition. It was very difficult to control the growth from competing with the trees, and those mounded plots, the trees really were limited, and the sprinkler treatments were slightly behind the dripper treatments. So that was last year. We've had the harvest this year. The samples are still being processed. General indications are that similar trends to 2021. Soil measures. Adding compost to the soil had no effect on water holding capacity between field capacity and your refill point, 6 and 60 kilopascals. I didn't expect that. I thought, hey, everybody knows that organic matter is good for water holding capacity. What's going on? But what I think is happening is that these samples were taken 12 months after the compost was applied, and it was perhaps trying to measure a direct impact of the compost on water holding capacity. Some work has been done adding compost to soil in laboratory work and testing water holding capacity, and the authors, Wallace and et al., found that the compost didn't have much direct effect unless the particles were less than 2 millimetres in diameter, and didn't really have a major effect unless they were 0.25 millimetres in diameter, so really, really, really fine. The compost we used was 12 mil screened, so there are this big chunks and mostly much larger stuff, so it may be that a direct effect of the compost addition wasn't found. However, this project the project itself finished late last year. We've received another round of funding for the overall project. It's going to go for another four years or so at somewhat of a reduced input level, but we'll be able to follow the yields, and we'll be resampling the soils later in the piece to see what has developed there. So no effect on water holding capacity, soil chemistry, bulk density, cation exchange capacity, an indicator of cellulose breakdown, penetrometer resistance, all improved by compost. All the other soil parameters were improved. The root growth, we did a DNA assay developed by SARDI to measure the amount of fine root material under the different treatments, and there was no effect between the treatments except the super soil, which had really light fluffy soil, very little penetrometer resistance, had more roots. However, because the trees had been challenged early on, they couldn't express what they were finding in the soil. So that's the soil results, mostly improved but not really expressed as yield. So the trial is ongoing. We'll be maintaining the treatments for the next number of years, and we'll be measuring yield every year. Then towards the end of it, we're going to have a more intensive look at the soils. It's possible that these trees are still pretty young. I mean, almond trees can be in the ground for 20 years. The initial yields may not reflect what happens later on by virtue of the tree maturity, and also soil management treatments are generally more long-term. So we'll be watching with interest to see how the yield story develops. And compost amendment improved almost everything we measured in soil parameters. So we're going to be reassessing that further down the track. Why didn't the trees grow more? When they had compost, when they had more organic matter, plenty of nutrients in the compost, particularly in the high rate. It may be. Roger Duncan in California has done work on compost and almond trees and found not much in the way of a yield response. And he theorised that perhaps the trees are actually pretty well watered. They've got plenty of fertiliser. Maybe there's not so much of a growth restraint for the compost to work on. If your soil conditions are okay, you've got plenty of water. It's not dry land, so they're not getting completely dry. You've got plenty of nutrients coming in. Maybe there's just not that much limitation, and the control treatments are doing pretty well anyway. That's a possibility. The soil physical parameters may take more time to change, and we'll see what happens with that further down the track. But that's where we are at the moment. Within this trial, at the moment, there is a small trial looking at soil carbon as affected by compost addition. There's an associated trial over at Select Harvest that Gunnar is involved in, associated site, and we're looking at rate of compost application, annual application, as it's affecting soil fertility, nutrient movement through the soil as measured by the concentration of soil water, tree nutrient status, and of course canopy size, tree size and yield. And so that's just another project which is funded through AgriFutures, which is currently on the same site. In fact, one of the soil pits we're looking at is in one of those plots. And that's it for me, thanks. That's a pretty quick run through. I'm happy to ask any questions. The guys at ACE here have been brilliant with setting up and running the trial. Anthony in particular, the orchard manager, went well above and beyond in setting up the trial with the many challenges we had with it. So thank you, that's me.